Protagonist Selected. Major Robert Kempner, American prosecutor at the Nuremberg Trials, chosen for his direct involvement in capturing, interrogating, and presenting evidence against Hermann Göring, providing a detailed, human-level perspective on the immediate post-war legal and moral reckoning. You believe the war ends when the last gun falls silent. You think that once the armies surrender, the maps are redrawn, and the treaties are signed, life simply resumes. You assume that the consequences of conflict are immediate, tangible, and finite. But the reality you face is far more complex. The war may have ended in May 1945, but the decisions that follow, the judgments imposed, and the secrets uncovered stretch far beyond the signing of surrender documents. You come to understand that endings are only the surface, and beneath them lies a complicated web of accountability, retribution, and unresolved ambition. You witness the ruins of Europe and see them not as empty shells of cities, but as evidence of a system that once operated with ruthless precision. Buildings lie in rubble, yet in the chaos, the most dangerous elements of the fallen regime have not yet been neutralized. You begin to track the individuals whose actions orchestrated destruction on an unimaginable scale. Among them, one figure dominates both in stature and infamy: Hermann Göring. You know Göring from photographs, from reports, from the words of those who suffered under the regime he helped shape. He is the embodiment of power entwined with corruption, of charisma intertwined with cruelty. You understand that the world will not simply forgive or forget. He must be held accountable. You prepare to confront him, to extract truth from the man whose presence commanded entire institutions of war. When you first encounter Göring, you are struck by the contradictions. He is imposing, self-assured, yet the veneer of authority does not mask the uncertainty beneath. His uniform, meticulously maintained even in defeat, signals a man clinging to status in a world that no longer acknowledges it. You recognize that this encounter is more than an arrest. It is a moment where history itself hangs in balance, where the narrative of justice begins to take shape. You think about the broader rule of post-war life: capture, interrogation, trial. These procedures exist to impose order, to assert that legality continues even when chaos has ruled. You witness the meticulous cataloging of evidence, the gathering of testimonies, the construction of a legal framework that seeks to define guilt, not as a matter of opinion, but as measurable and prosecutable fact. You observe how this rule extends beyond immediate retribution. It attempts to map morality, to quantify responsibility, to translate the enormity of destruction into something a court can understand. You follow Göring through the early days of captivity. The Allies have captured him in Bavaria, finding him with a mixture of nonchalance and defiance. He does not resist, yet he does not concede. He is aware that his reputation precedes him, that the weight of history presses against his shoulders. You witness him navigating the uncertainty of his situation, a man accustomed to command, now forced to obey. Even in detention, he exercises influence, subtly testing the boundaries of authority, assessing the men around him who now hold his fate in their hands. You reflect on the first interrogations. You ask questions, you document answers, you confront him with the evidence amassed over years of conflict. He is articulate, clever, sometimes evasive. You sense the strategy behind every gesture, every pause. He understands the stakes. Every statement he makes is calculated, yet in his calculation, you glimpse the human vulnerability that power had long concealed. He attempts to rationalize his actions, to situate them within a framework of loyalty and duty. You do not accept excuses. You catalogue each response meticulously, understanding that this record will form the foundation of the trial. You observe the psychological dimensions at work. He displays moments of bravado, recounting military campaigns and decisions as if to remind you that his role was central, indispensable. Yet you notice cracks, fleeting acknowledgements of fear and uncertainty, hints that even the architect of terror is not immune to doubt. You consider how the human mind adapts when confronted with the enormity of its own crimes. You realize that the interrogation is as much a study in psychology as it is a pursuit of legal accountability. You understand that the rule of post-war justice is more than punishment. It is the careful articulation of moral boundaries, the establishment of precedents, and the recording of history. Göring becomes a focal point of this effort. He is not merely a defendant. He is a symbol, the litmus test for the Allied commitment to lawful redress. Every interaction, every decision about his treatment, informs the structure of the trials to come. You feel the weight of responsibility, knowing that the eyes of the world are upon this process and that missteps here could undermine the legitimacy of justice itself. You see the war's physical aftermath mirrored in the human landscape. Prisoners, displaced persons, and surviving officials populate a Europe in flux. You walk through camps and temporary detentions, noting the spectrum of human behavior in the shadow of collapse. Some cling to loyalty, others seek to distance themselves from the past, while Göring remains steadfast in presenting himself as untouchable, a man still commanding attention even in chains. You understand that holding him is not merely a question of security. It is a test of authority and order in a continent struggling to rebuild. You begin to recognize patterns. High-ranking officials often exhibit a combination of denial and pragmatism, attempting to negotiate survival while maintaining a semblance of honor. Göring exemplifies this. He negotiates with guards, requests comforts, and leverages knowledge of international dynamics. You see how the rule operates unevenly. The Allies must balance humanity with justice, strategy with fairness. Every decision carries implications for the trials and for the broader perception of Allied integrity. You participate in the meticulous preparation for the Nuremberg Trials. Every document, every intercepted communication, every witness statement is cross-referenced. You see Göring's network unfold through papers, memos, and testimonies, revealing the scope of his influence. The scale is staggering. You realize that capturing a man is only the first step. Understanding the machinery he controlled is equally critical. You begin to map connections, from political maneuverings to economic exploitation, from military command to ideological enforcement. You notice the tension between immediacy and deliberation. The world demands swift justice, yet the complexity of evidence and law requires patience. Göring's fate will not be decided by impulse, but by meticulous construction of case and counter-case. You recognize that this process tests your resolve as much as his. Every interview, every assessment, challenges your assumptions about guilt, responsibility, and the capacity of law to address crimes of unprecedented scale. You observe how Göring interacts with other detainees. There is an air of hierarchy even in confinement, a residual power dynamic from the world that has collapsed around you. He assumes a role, subtly asserting dominance, testing loyalties, and gauging the intentions of both peers and captors. You understand that these interactions are instructive, providing insight into the mindset of those who orchestrated mass violence and how that mindset may persist even after defeat. You track the emergence of strategic discussions among the Allies. Questions arise. How will trials be structured? Which defendants merit individual focus? How will evidence be preserved and presented? Göring becomes central to these deliberations. You witness debates over legal philosophy, the limits of international law, and the moral imperative to document history accurately. Every choice reflects a negotiation between principle and practicality, between expedience and enduring accountability. You recognize that the immediate post-war environment is a test of governance itself. The Allies must impose order on a continent in ruins, while simultaneously upholding standards that will set precedents for generations. Göring's capture, detention, and interrogation are not isolated events. They are part of a broader experiment in legal, moral, and administrative restoration. You understand that what happens to him will reverberate far beyond the walls of Nuremberg. You begin to catalogue Göring's statements, gestures, and reactions with care. Each moment carries potential significance for the trials. You observe how he balances arrogance with calculation, charm with intimidation, and defiance with cautious compliance. You understand that documenting these subtleties is essential to establishing a narrative that transcends mere accusation, one that conveys both the breadth of his actions and the complexity of human responsibility. You note that the physical conditions of detention influence behavior. Göring maintains routines, monitors his appearance, and asserts control over small elements of daily life. You interpret these behaviors as coping mechanisms, ways to preserve identity in an environment designed to strip power. You understand that even the smallest gestures can reveal mindset, intention, and the potential for cooperation or resistance. You witness the tension between personal accountability and collective responsibility. Göring often frames his actions as part of a larger machinery deflecting individual guilt. You recognize that one of the central challenges of post-war justice is dismantling this narrative, demonstrating that systemic evil cannot absolve personal choice. You begin to assemble evidence to confront these claims, understanding that clarity of documentation will be as important as the legal arguments themselves. You observe the incremental process of legal structuring. Investigators, prosecutors, and clerks work tirelessly to translate chaos into order. Göring's dossier grows daily, a record of decisions, commands, and correspondences that illustrate the depth of his involvement. You realize that this process is itself a form of accountability. By preserving facts, you ensure that future generations can understand the mechanisms of power, obedience, and complicity. You reflect on the paradox of post-war authority. You, as a representative of the victors, wield control over prisoners who once commanded legions. Yet your power is constrained by law, ethics, and the imperative of historical accuracy. Göring tests these boundaries constantly, probing for weakness, seeking advantage. You understand that maintaining the integrity of the rule is as critical as securing compliance. You observe the psychological interplay in early interrogations. Göring oscillates between bravado and resignation, often attempting to charm, distract, or intimidate. You remain vigilant, noting inconsistencies, identifying manipulation, and ensuring that the pursuit of truth is not derailed. You understand that the process is as much about perception as it is about fact, and that the moral authority of the Allies depends on meticulous adherence to procedure. You follow the extraction of testimony from those who served under Göring. You witness the painstaking collection of evidence from individuals who navigated fear, loyalty, and survival. Their accounts fill in gaps, providing context to Göring's decisions, revealing patterns of command, and illustrating the human consequences of policy. You recognize that these testimonies will form the backbone of the trial, bridging the gap between abstract law and lived experience. You observe the tension between immediacy and documentation. Göring's charm, wit, and defiance are compelling, yet every statement must be weighed against the written record. You meticulously compare interviews, cross-reference dates, and seek corroboration. You understand that accuracy is paramount, that any misstep could compromise the legitimacy of the tribunal. You notice how Göring's health and demeanor fluctuate under confinement. He exhibits periods of energy, engagement, and theatricality, contrasted with moments of fatigue, withdrawal, and frustration. You recognize these patterns as reflective of both personality and circumstance, offering insight into how power collapses when authority is stripped. You observe interactions between Göring and other high-ranking detainees. Alliances, rivalries, and histories surface in subtle ways. He negotiates influence, asserts hierarchy, and gauges loyalty. You understand that these dynamics are not merely social. They inform both legal strategy and psychological assessment, shaping how each defendant will be presented to the tribunal. You follow the development of legal strategy. You participate in discussions about charges, evidentiary thresholds, and the presentation of context. Göring's case exemplifies challenges inherent in prosecuting systemic crimes, distinguishing individual culpability from bureaucratic function, assessing intent, and framing moral responsibility. You grasp that the trial is as much an intellectual exercise as a moral one, requiring precision, patience, and perspective. You witness the meticulous cataloging of Göring's possessions, documents, and personal effects. Each item is recorded, preserved, and analyzed. You recognize that these artifacts are more than evidence. They are historical testimony, providing insight into character, priorities, and networks of influence. Even small details, letters, notes, schedules, become critical in constructing a coherent account of responsibility. You see the Allies balancing transparency with discretion. Some evidence is sensitive, implicating individuals or revealing intelligence methods. You note that decisions about what to present publicly and what to restrict influence both the perception of fairness and the operational security of ongoing post-war activities. Göring's case is central to this balancing act, as it involves high-profile accountability that attracts global attention. You reflect on the broader ethical landscape. You understand that pursuing justice in the aftermath of mass violence is inherently fraught. Göring embodies the moral contradictions of post-war reckoning, the need for punishment tempered by due process, the demand for historical clarity weighed against political considerations, and the human tendency toward rationalization confronted by systematic evidence. You observe how procedural rigor shapes interactions. Each interrogation, each cross-examination, is guided by rules intended to protect both fairness and accuracy. Göring often attempts to exploit ambiguities, testing the resolve of his captors. You maintain diligence, understanding that the credibility of the tribunal hinges on consistency, impartiality, and the disciplined application of law. You track the emergence of a narrative framework for the trials. Charges are organized by category, conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Göring's actions intersect each domain. You recognize that constructing this framework requires careful interpretation of evidence, linking abstract principles to concrete decisions, and ensuring that legal reasoning is defensible and comprehensible. You observe the human dimension of accountability. Göring's demeanor, attitudes, and defenses illuminate broader truths about power, obedience, and complicity. You recognize that his behavior offers a case study not only in criminality, but in the psychological and social dynamics that enable systemic evil. You begin to appreciate that the trials are an opportunity to document these lessons for posterity, transforming individual accountability into collective understanding. You participate in the preparation of charges, noting how Göring's portfolio of influence complicates categorization. Economic exploitation, military command, political manipulation, and ideological enforcement intertwine. You recognize that unraveling these threads is essential to demonstrating responsibility, establishing precedent, and conveying the scale of the crimes committed. You reflect on the delicate interplay of justice and diplomacy. The Allies must coordinate strategy, manage public perception, and maintain credibility. Göring's high profile magnifies these challenges. You note that each procedural choice, from detention conditions to presentation of evidence, carries ramifications that extend beyond the courtroom. You track the initial psychological assessments of Göring. Experts note his intelligence, charisma, and strategic acumen, balanced against egocentrism, manipulation, and moral detachment. You understand that these assessments inform both legal strategy and the handling of daily interactions, shaping the approach to interrogation, trial preparation, and potential risk management. You observe the development of a precedent in international law. Göring's trial will test the boundaries of accountability, applying principles of justice to actions taken under the authority of a state. You grasp that this is uncharted territory. No previous tribunal has addressed systemic crimes of such scale, nor has it confronted the question of individual responsibility within complex hierarchies. You follow the collation of evidence from occupied territories. Documents, eyewitness statements, and forensic reports converge to form a detailed account of Göring's influence. You see the interconnections of political decisions, economic mechanisms, and military operations. You recognize that this documentation is essential not only for prosecution, but for historical record and for shaping post-war governance. You notice the tensions among prosecutors, investigators, and historians. Debates emerge over interpretation, emphasis, and framing. Göring's case is emblematic. How do you present a figure who embodies both administrative genius and moral corruption? You recognize that narrative choices will influence public understanding, legal precedent, and the perceived legitimacy of post-war justice. You track Göring's behavior during preparatory hearings. He oscillates between cooperation and defiance, employing charm, wit, and psychological maneuvering. You observe how these tactics reveal both confidence and vulnerability, insight and opportunism. You understand that these dynamics will shape both courtroom strategy and the broader historical record. You reflect on the personal dimensions of post-war accountability. Göring's family, associates, and loyalists remain in a state of uncertainty, while victims and survivors seek acknowledgement and redress. You recognize that the tribunal is not only a legal exercise, but a social and moral intervention, attempting to reconcile the human consequences of power with the demands of justice. You participate in early strategic meetings about the structure of the tribunal. Questions of jurisdiction, scope, and evidence weighting dominate discussions. Göring's prominence makes him a focal point. You understand that the decisions made here will define the framework of international criminal law for generations, and that meticulous preparation is essential to ensure fairness, accuracy, and legitimacy. You follow the gradual accumulation of testimony from witnesses across Europe. Survivors recount experiences under Göring's policies, detailing the mechanisms of oppression and the consequences of his authority. You note how these accounts are meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and contextualized, forming a comprehensive narrative that links individual experiences to systemic decisions. You observe how Göring navigates the psychological environment of detention. He engages in routines, maintains appearances, and negotiates influence. You recognize these behaviors as attempts to assert control, maintain identity, and influence perception. Each interaction becomes data, a subtle indicator of mindset, strategy, and potential risk. You witness the meticulous cataloging of Göring's communications. Letters, orders, and memos reveal patterns of command, networks of loyalty, and the scope of decision-making authority. You understand that these documents will serve as both evidence and historical record, illustrating the mechanisms by which systemic power translates into human consequence. You see the interplay of law, psychology, and strategy shaping each encounter. Göring tests boundaries, probing for weakness, gauging authority, and asserting dominance. You maintain procedural rigor, documenting responses, noting inconsistencies, and preparing counter-arguments. You understand that the credibility of the tribunal rests on meticulous adherence to process, not on personal sentiment. You observe the evolving narrative of accountability. Göring's actions intersect political, economic, and military domains, illustrating the complexity of post-war reckoning. You recognize that presenting this narrative requires balancing clarity with nuance, establishing causality without oversimplification, and demonstrating responsibility without descending into vengeance. You note the human resilience required in post-war investigation. Witnesses, prosecutors, and investigators navigate trauma, moral uncertainty, and the weight of history. You observe how these challenges shape approach, interpretation, and judgment, and how the treatment of Göring becomes a test of procedural integrity and ethical consistency. You follow the process of translating evidence into formal charges. Each decision, each action, is contextualized and cross-referenced. Göring's influence is vast, his decisions complex, and his culpability intertwined with the machinery of state. You understand that constructing an airtight case requires attention to detail, historical understanding, and legal acumen. You see the preparation of psychological profiles alongside legal strategy. Experts analyze behavior, communication patterns, and decision-making tendencies. Göring's intelligence, charisma, and self-perception are contrasted with patterns of manipulation, risk-taking, and moral detachment. You recognize that these profiles inform both courtroom presentation and management during detention. You observe the emergence of a comprehensive legal and historical record. Every interview, memorandum, and intercepted communication is catalogued with precision. Göring's actions are traced from policy conception to implementation, revealing the interconnected nature of political authority and personal ambition. You recognize that this documentation will not only serve the trials, but will define the standard for understanding systemic crimes in the modern era. You follow the Allied efforts to standardize procedures across occupied zones. Each military and civilian authority contributes evidence, reconciles discrepancies, and ensures consistency. Göring's case exemplifies the necessity of cohesion. Only through rigorous collaborative effort can the enormity of his influence be fully captured. You understand that any lapse could compromise both justice and historical truth. You witness Göring navigating this environment with a mixture of confidence and calculation. He is aware that his prominence makes him both a target and a symbol. You note how he manages communications with fellow detainees, maintains routines, and seeks to assert influence where possible. These behaviors reveal not only his character, but also the persistent human need for agency, even in captivity. You participate in early debates about sentencing philosophy. The Allies wrestle with how to balance retribution, deterrence, and moral education. Göring's potential punishment is central to these discussions. You recognize that establishing proportionality and consistency is essential, particularly in the context of crimes of unprecedented scale. You observe the meticulous preparation of exhibits for the trial. Artifacts, documents, photographs, and testimonies are organized to construct a clear, chronological account. Göring's involvement in each phase of the Nazi hierarchy is mapped and contextualized, providing both legal clarity and historical insight. You understand that presentation is as critical as content, ensuring that the tribunal's decisions are grounded in evidence rather than rhetoric. You note the emerging tension between public expectation and legal procedure. Media, governments, and survivors demand swift justice, yet procedural thoroughness cannot be sacrificed. Göring's notoriety amplifies scrutiny. You understand that maintaining credibility requires discipline, transparency, and a commitment to fairness at every stage. You follow Göring's engagement with his defense team. He challenges, questions, and strategizes. You observe how he seeks to influence perception, negotiate concessions, and protect personal legacy. These interactions reveal not only his tactical acumen, but also the limitations of human foresight when confronted with systemic accountability. You track the psychological dynamics among the detainees. Göring interacts with former colleagues, rivals, and subordinates, revealing networks of loyalty and tension. You recognize that these interactions inform both legal strategy and understanding of internal hierarchies, offering insight into the mechanisms that enabled and sustained the regime. You observe the incremental assembly of case files, each cross-referenced with corroborating evidence. Göring's influence is dissected into actionable instances, from policy directives to direct orders, illustrating both breadth and depth. You understand that this granularity is essential for establishing culpability beyond reasonable doubt. You note the human dimension of documentation. Witnesses recount experiences marked by fear, coercion, and survival. You recognize the moral responsibility of accurately representing these accounts, ensuring that the voices of those impacted are neither diminished nor overshadowed by the prominence of the defendant. You follow discussions regarding courtroom procedure. The Allies establish protocols for testimony, cross-examination, and presentation of evidence. Göring's high profile necessitates particular attention to fairness, security, and public perception. You understand that these decisions will influence both the trial's outcome and its historical legitimacy. You witness Göring's strategic self-presentation. He is careful, articulate, and deliberate, aware that demeanor can influence both tribunal perception and historical record. You note how he balances defiance with engagement, projecting authority, while navigating constraints. You track the development of the formal indictment. Charges are precisely framed, linking individual actions to systemic crimes. Göring's case spans economic exploitation, military strategy, and political leadership, illustrating the interconnection of personal agency and institutional machinery. You understand that constructing these links is critical to demonstrating individual accountability. You observe the meticulous preparation of cross-examinations. Each witness's account is reviewed, inconsistencies are identified, and potential strategies are anticipated. Göring's tactics are studied in advance, ensuring that the tribunal can address deflection, rationalization, and manipulation effectively. You note the emerging pattern of cooperation and resistance among detainees. Göring alternates between defiance, charm, and negotiation. You recognize that understanding these patterns is essential for maintaining security, ensuring accurate testimony, and projecting procedural authority. You participate in finalizing evidentiary exhibits. Photographs, documents, and artifacts are organized chronologically and thematically. Göring's role in policy formation, implementation, and enforcement is clearly delineated, providing a coherent narrative for both legal and historical purposes. You observe debates over interpretive framing. How should actions be contextualized? To what extent should systemic pressures mitigate or accentuate responsibility? Göring's prominence magnifies these questions. You understand that the tribunal must balance clarity, fairness, and historical accuracy in every interpretive choice. You follow Göring's interactions with guards, fellow detainees, and legal personnel. He tests boundaries, asserts influence, and gauges reactions. You recognize these behaviors as extensions of the personality that wielded immense power during the war, providing insight into resilience, ego, and the persistence of authority under constraint. You track the preparation of procedural manuals for the tribunal. Guidelines for evidence handling, witness protection, and legal argumentation are developed. Göring's case serves as a benchmark, illustrating challenges and solutions for high-profile prosecution. You understand that these manuals will shape future international legal practice. You observe the systematic cross-referencing of evidence. Orders, communications, and reports are meticulously analyzed, revealing both the chain of command and the scope of personal initiative. Göring's responsibility is mapped with precision, illustrating how individual decisions translate into systemic consequences. You follow discussions of legal philosophy among the prosecution team. Questions of intent, culpability, and precedent dominate. Göring's case is a litmus test for establishing the limits of individual accountability within a hierarchical state apparatus. You understand that these discussions will define the interpretive framework for post-war justice. You witness Göring maintaining routines, monitoring appearance, and asserting small elements of control. These behaviors reveal both psychological coping mechanisms and an enduring assertion of identity. You recognize that such details, while seemingly minor, offer critical insight into the human dimension of accountability. You observe the integration of testimony, evidence, and legal argument into coherent case files. Each instance of influence, each decision, and each consequence is documented. Göring's role emerges with clarity, both as an individual actor and as part of a broader system of authority. You track the emergence of psychological profiles used to anticipate courtroom behavior. Analysts assess communication patterns, risk-taking tendencies, and defensive strategies. Göring's intelligence, charisma, and self-perception are juxtaposed with patterns of manipulation and moral detachment. You understand that these insights will guide both trial strategy and detainee management. You follow the process of constructing the indictment. Each charge is tied to documented action, demonstrating causality and intent. Göring's extensive portfolio of authority necessitates detailed articulation of responsibility, linking administrative decisions to human consequences. You observe debates regarding courtroom logistics, seating arrangements, security measures, and procedural sequencing are planned meticulously. Göring's prominence requires particular attention to both safety and optics, ensuring that the tribunal maintains authority while projecting fairness. You track Göring's preparation with his defense team. He studies precedent, anticipates questions, and considers narrative framing. You note how these preparations reflect both intelligence and a keen awareness of the stakes involved. You witness the final assembly of evidence into trial binders. Each document, photograph, and testimonial excerpt is carefully annotated and cross-referenced. Göring's influence, reach, and decision-making are made visible with clarity, forming the backbone of the legal case. You observe the tension between procedural fidelity and public expectation. Media, governments, and survivor communities demand both thoroughness and expedience. Göring's high profile amplifies scrutiny, compelling diligence, transparency, and disciplined adherence to established rules. You follow the final rounds of interrogation. Göring continues to assert dominance, charm, and deflection, yet cracks in his narrative begin to surface. You note these moments carefully, recognizing their potential significance for courtroom argumentation. You participate in the organization of trial strategy meetings. Legal arguments, evidentiary priorities, and witness sequences are meticulously planned. Göring's behavior informs each decision, guiding the approach to ensure clarity, fairness, and persuasive impact. You witness the first steps of courtroom simulation exercises. Prosecution teams rehearse questioning, anticipate defense strategies, and practice procedural adherence. Göring's anticipated responses shape these rehearsals, reflecting the intersection of psychology and legal strategy. You track the integration of multinational legal perspectives. Allies reconcile differences in approach, interpretation, and precedent. Göring's case serves as a unifying focus, demanding coordination, compromise, and shared commitment to principles of justice. You observe the final preparation of witness statements. Survivors, subordinates, and collaborators provide accounts that illuminate both systemic function and individual choice. Göring's actions are contextualized within this network of testimony, creating a comprehensive portrait of influence and responsibility. You note the emerging awareness of symbolic significance. Göring is not only a defendant, but a representation of the mechanisms, ambitions, and moral failings of the regime he served. Every procedural choice, from detention conditions to presentation of evidence, carries weight beyond the individual case. You follow the meticulous verification of documentary evidence. Orders, correspondence, and memoranda are cross-checked for authenticity and accuracy. Göring's network and influence are traced with precision, ensuring that every claim is substantiated and defensible. You observe the preparation of expert testimony. Analysts, historians, and economists contribute detailed assessments of Göring's decisions, policies, and systemic impact. You recognize that these inputs will be essential in translating complex administrative actions into comprehensible legal arguments. You witness the development of courtroom strategy in response to anticipated defense maneuvers. Göring's intelligence and rhetorical skill require careful anticipation, ensuring that the prosecution can maintain credibility, coherence, and persuasive force. You track the coordination of evidence presentation. Timelines, thematic groupings, and corroborative materials are organized to provide clarity. Göring's actions are illustrated across multiple domains, linking decision to consequence, authority to outcome. You follow the integration of survivor narratives into the legal framework. Accounts are contextualized, verified, and presented to convey both systemic patterns and human impact. Göring's role is illuminated through these lived experiences, grounding abstract charges in concrete reality. You observe the procedural rehearsal of opening statements. Teams practice pacing, emphasis, and narrative flow. Göring's anticipated reactions shape these exercises, reflecting the interplay of psychology and legal argumentation. You note the preparation of counter-evidence strategies. Defense claims are anticipated, rebuttals formulated, and evidence organized to address potential gaps. Göring's meticulous self-presentation requires equally meticulous preparation from the prosecution. You track the assembly of visual exhibits. Maps, charts, and diagrams are designed to illustrate chains of command, operational structures, and policy impact. Göring's sphere of influence is depicted with clarity, allowing both tribunal and audience to comprehend complexity. You witness the final review of legal documentation. Each line of argument, each piece of evidence, each witness statement is scrutinized. Göring's case emerges as both comprehensive and coherent, ensuring that prosecution, tribunal, and historical record are aligned. You follow the moment when all preparations converge. Evidence, testimony, psychological profiles, and legal strategy are integrated. Göring's detention, interrogation, and documentation culminate in a meticulously structured framework. Ready to confront the tribunal, you observe the tension and anticipation in the days leading up to the trial. Göring maintains routine, projects confidence, and subtly tests the resolve of those around him. You recognize that every behavior, every gesture, carries potential significance for both legal strategy and historical record. You participate in final coordination meetings among prosecutors. Schedules, evidence sequences, and narrative emphasis are confirmed. Göring's case serves as the central axis around which procedural and strategic decisions revolve. You witness the preparation of supplementary exhibits, addressing anticipated challenges and reinforcing core arguments. Göring's decisions, statements, and communications are meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and contextualized to withstand scrutiny. You track the rehearsals for witness testimony. Procedural guidance, narrative emphasis, and evidentiary clarity are reinforced. Göring's anticipated responses shape the sequencing, questioning, and framing of each account. You observe the final alignment of legal and historical perspectives. Prosecution teams ensure that the narrative is coherent, evidence-based, and historically accurate. Göring's actions, influence, and responsibility are clearly articulated, forming a comprehensive record for tribunal consideration. You follow the psychological preparation of the prosecution team. Anticipating Göring's tactics, managing personal biases, and maintaining procedural discipline are emphasized. You recognize that success depends not only on evidence, but also on clarity, composure, and ethical consistency. You observe the integration of cross-national legal norms. Allies reconcile procedural differences, harmonizing standards to ensure fairness and legitimacy. Göring's high-profile status necessitates particular attention to equitable treatment and uniform application of law. You track the assembly of final trial binders. Every document, photograph, memo, and testimonial excerpt is cross-referenced, annotated, and sequenced. Göring's case is rendered with precision, illustrating both systemic patterns and individual decisions. You participate in rehearsals of cross-examinations, refining questioning strategies, anticipating evasions, and preparing rebuttals. Göring's intelligence and rhetorical skill shape every procedural decision, requiring meticulous attention to detail and anticipation. You witness the alignment of procedural, historical, and psychological perspectives. Each element, evidence, testimony, argumentation, is integrated to present a coherent, defensible, and comprehensive case. Göring's actions, motives, and consequences are fully documented, preparing the tribunal for a rigorous assessment. You track the final stages of pre-trial preparation. Schedules, exhibits, witness orders, and narrative flow are confirmed. Göring remains aware, assertive, and calculating, testing the boundaries of confinement while projecting an image of control. You observe the culmination of months of preparation. Every element, documentation, strategy, psychological insight, procedural rigor, is aligned to confront the tribunal. Göring's influence, decisions, and actions are rendered in full clarity, establishing the foundation for both accountability and historical record. You note the tension in the air as the trial approaches. The world watches, the victims await recognition, and the mechanisms of justice prepare to engage a man whose actions shaped an era. Göring remains a figure of charisma, calculation, and defiance, embodying the complex intersection of individual agency and systemic evil. You recognize that the rule of post-war accountability is now entering its decisive phase. The work of months, interrogation, documentation, analysis, and preparation culminates in a confrontation that will define precedent, measure justice, and illuminate both human and institutional responsibility. You follow the final moments before the tribunal convenes. Prosecutors review key points, witness schedules, and evidentiary sequences. Göring prepares, projects confidence, and subtly asserts presence. You understand that this moment marks the transition from preparation to execution, from documentation to formal adjudication, and from captivity to the courtroom. You observe the culmination of Act 1. The belief that war ends with surrender gives way to the reality that the aftermath is governed by rules, preparation, and the careful orchestration of justice. Göring, once a master of power, now becomes the subject of the very system he once influenced, standing at the threshold of history as the tribunal prepares to weigh evidence, interpret responsibility, and render judgment in a world forever altered by conflict. You step back, aware that the stage is set, that the rules are enforced, and that the narrative of post-war accountability is ready to unfold. The war may have ended, but the aftermath, meticulous, deliberate, and fraught with moral and legal complexity, is only beginning. Act 2. The context begins now, as Europe collapses under the weight of surrender, chaos, and the slow, deliberate assertion of order, and you find yourself witnessing the introduction of Göring not merely as a defendant, but as a symbol, an architect, and a human being poised on the threshold of reckoning. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 is not a singular event, but a cascade of collapses. Cities lie in ruin, infrastructure has been dismantled, and the social fabric is frayed. Needs of survival. Amid this, Hermann Göring's capture represents a critical juncture, a point at which legal authority confronts the remnants of a regime that had once wielded almost unchecked power. You witness the initial confusion of post-surrender Bavaria, where Göring is apprehended. Soldiers and officers converge, processing detainees, cataloguing property, and ensuring security. Göring, aware of his own significance, maintains composure, projecting authority even in confinement. You see how the capture of a single individual becomes a focal point for broader efforts to establish order and accountability. You observe the chaos of administration in the immediate aftermath. Military and civilian authorities grapple with displaced populations, destruction of infrastructure, and the urgent need to re-establish governance. In this environment, securing high-profile detainees like Göring is not merely a matter of custody. It is an exercise in stabilizing authority, demonstrating control, and setting the precedent for lawful process. You note the psychological climate among both captors and detainees. Fear, uncertainty, and suspicion pervade, yet a disciplined approach is necessary. Göring is acutely aware of this dynamic, navigating interactions with guards, fellow detainees, and officials to maintain presence and influence. You recognize that understanding these human dimensions is critical to both immediate management and the preparation of subsequent legal proceedings. You follow Göring's transfer to secure detention facilities. Each movement is calculated, both for security and symbolic purposes. You observe the careful coordination required to transport a man of his notoriety safely, minimizing risk while conveying the assertion of order. You witness the early interactions between Göring and Allied officials. Interrogations are methodical, probing decisions, responsibilities, and networks of influence. You note how the balance between procedural rigor and psychological strategy is maintained, ensuring that the collection of evidence is thorough and defensible. You see the first documentation of Göring's statements. Every word, gesture, and hesitation is recorded. You understand that these records are not mere transcripts. They are instruments of accountability, historical evidence, and legal preparation. Each notation contributes to a narrative that will soon be tested in the tribunal. You observe the broader context of Europe at this time. Displaced persons camps fill with survivors, former officials are questioned, and military operations pivot to occupation and reconstruction. Göring's presence within this milieu exemplifies the intersection of individual culpability and systemic collapse. You track the coordination between national and international authorities. Questions arise regarding jurisdiction, procedural consistency, and evidence sharing. Göring's high-profile status necessitates precise alignment of legal and operational frameworks. You note how these efforts lay the groundwork for the Nuremberg Trials. You witness the psychological and logistical management of detainees. Göring maintains routines, asserts influence, and navigates interactions with both guards and fellow prisoners. You recognize that these behaviors, while subtle, offer insight into resilience, strategy, and the persistence of authority even under constraint. You follow the initial establishment of investigative teams. Allied officials, military officers, and civilian experts collaborate to